thank you enough. I can't thank you enough for choosing to be with us and making that choice a priority for you today. All those words being said, I'd like to at least turn things over towards to someone who has a great connection to our community and has chosen to be a part of this process. And we invite you to listen, engage, and feel enlightened as we move forward. Please welcome Anthony Taylor.
Good evening, everyone. We are really excited that you all are here. And on behalf of the team of the Cultural Wellness Center, our other partners at PPL, Wells Fargo and Wells Fargo Foundation, as well as our community partners that are engaged with us with the Kingfield Neighborhood Association, Whittier Neighborhood Association, Lindale Association, and the Central Bryan Neighborhood Association. We are a year in a few days past the moment that created a movement in our city, and we are excited to launch this process. One of the areas that, of course, was impacted was right at Lake and Nicollet, the former Wells Fargo site, and we have begun a relationship with the owners of the property, Wells Fargo, a really amazing community development organization, PPL, and we are looking at what can happen around development that has lasting impact on community. We see this as an amazing moment in time, and so you're invited to be a part of this. This is something that is going to last for a part of summer. So really, we are looking at this is just the beginning. And please stay involved with us and stay tuned for what is about to come. We will be looking at a cadence of about every 2 weeks after today, where we'll have an opportunity for us to get together, share information, share opinions, and eventually, if all works out, we are excited because we believe we'll get an opportunity to be in person. We may do some outdoors activities as well. So thank you all for being here, and again, welcome. So Team Michael, take it back.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for shedding some light and some clarity. As you can see, as your cultural ambassador for the Cultural Wellness Center, my role is part that of a griot, part that of a community member, and part that of a person who's culturally committed to community and those connections. And speaking of connections, Anthony made mention of a gentleman who will be speaking next, who has a great connection to the South Minneapolis community and across the city of Minneapolis. His footprint is, now, please forgive me if I'm waxing too poetic, but his footprint is wide and full and large. Now that might sound not like a compliment, but this gentleman knows that it's coming from the heart. So please welcome the CEO of Project for Pride in Living. That's Paul Williams.
Thank you, T. Michael. Good to see you again. Always good to see you. And I love the cultural ambassador. That's yet another title that you take on, and really really wonderful and very, very accurate. So thanks to everyone, and welcome to all of you to what I think is really kind of a bit of a new way of doing business. It's a new way of doing business, but it's actually an old way of doing business, isn't it? It's an old way of doing business that places community at the center of the work, that places voice at the center of the work. Place matters, and this place in particular matters a lot, but people matter and voice matters as well. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. PPL's thrilled to be part of this project, and for those of you who don't know, PPL's been around for about 50 years. We've been in the housing development arena for many years. We do a lot of employment and training. We run a couple of alternative high schools. We are a community development organization at our heart. Our founder, Joe Salvaggio, a former social justice advocate, anti-war activist, moved into this very neighborhood, basically, and said, I'm going to live here and we're going to start rebuilding brick by brick. And PPL has been in and around this neighborhood for many years, all the neighborhoods, Central, Phillips, right? Whittier, Powderhorn, North Side, South Side, St. Paul, East Side, and including the suburbs in recent years. So 50 years we've been working in and around community development. For me personally, I am born and raised in the Rondo neighborhood. I am a son of Rondo, fourth generation from that community. And this is a neighborhood that I transited through often. I took the 21A from Selby and Lexington all the way up to Hennepin and Lake and all points in between. I transferred at this very corner to catch the 18G, which was the Nicollet bus going north and south through this neighborhood. And my work for many years, when I was at LISC, when I was at the Minneapolis Foundation, and certainly now at PPL, has brought me into relationship with community and building assets. PPL's mission speaks to hope, assets, self-reliance. That is fundamentally what we are about, and that is work that I have done in a variety of places for many years. And so it's no coincidence that PPL finds itself in this work. We have worked for well over 20 plus years with the Cultural Wellness Center. We've been active up at the Midtown development and the global market. We built the housing around the parking ramp there. We've built housing throughout the Phillips neighborhood. The Portland Place redevelopment was largely led by PPL. We owned and built the Mercado in partnership with the cooperative owners, Latino business owners in that building. So again, it is no coincidence that we find ourselves in the heart of what I think is going to be a really exciting redevelopment. One of the things that we've been talking about at PPL, and I've been talking about in particular in this last year, post George Floyd's murder, is how we rebuild matters as much as what we rebuild. Let me say that again. How we rebuild is as important as what we rebuild. And when we think about how we rebuild, that's where I think this new model of equitable development, is about voice. It's about centering BIPOC communities. It's about capacity building, It's not just about building something, putting it in the ground, and then saying, yep, there we go, we're all done, It is about a longer term commitment to community and to centering community voice and community power in the very process of the development. And so your voice, many voices matters here, not just in helping to figure out what is it that we're going to build here, but how will the people engage here long-term? How will we build community and culture here? How will this maintain culture? How will we build wealth through this process and in this community? So those are all things that are at the heart of the work that we do at PPL. Really grateful. We've been a longtime partner with Wells Fargo. We will own the site and we will develop this site. And so Wells Fargo will be a partner in that. But PPL is going to be driving this alongside of the community, alongside of Cultural Wellness Center. And so I just want to be kind of clear about that up front. We're very clear about accountability at PPL, and that is the role that we will play here. We're really excited to be working on this and really look forward to what's to come. So back to you, T. Michael.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. How is as important as what we build and how we develop. And you spoke of so many different elements of the process that PPL has had throughout its 50-year history and its connection, and how as the driver of that vehicle, that there's plenty of room for the other partners who are working together in tandem on this project. I want to also lead out with a comment to those of us who came in to this program this evening with the hope of finding interpreters. We do not have interpreters this evening, and I want to just share that with you so that if you were inquiring or curious as to that, those are not present or available tonight, but we'll make it a point to ensure with our future iterations of this programming that we do have that all in place, if you will. But speaking of, if you will, it's my time to share the next person's name who's going to be speaking with you this evening. Her name is Patty Pancook. Patty is the Senior Vice President, community partners, or community relations, and from Wells Fargo's foundation. She's the senior consultant. She is the relations lead consultant. Let's turn our attention to Patty Pancook.
Always best to unmute first, right? Thank you, T. Michael, and thank you to Anthony and to the group tonight that's come together. We are just so delighted, and I feel a little bit of excitement tonight as we come together to think about what can be at the site of 3030 Nicollet, which is the former site of our Wells Fargo branch office. And I'm looking forward to just hearing from all of you tonight. And I would just say to the group that's here, Paul said it really well, that this is an opportunity to hear your voice. And I would encourage all of you to share very openly what your thoughts are and what your expectations and hopes are for the new site that will be at 3030 Nicollet. So, as T. Michael said, I'm Patty Pancook, and I'm a community relations leader at Wells Fargo. And I have a very personal connection to 3030 Nicollet. I actually officed out of the second floor from 2005 through 2009. And then when I accepted the community relations position in 2016, I returned to 3030 Nicollet and had been working out of that office until the pandemic sent us home in mid-March of 2020. So, you know, why is a community relations person here tonight from Wells Fargo versus maybe one of our key leaders? And what I will tell you is that the redevelopment at 3030 is a really important part of our community relations strategy. We want the very best for that site. And so as we move forward, we really want to think about how our purpose within community relations at Wells Fargo ties very closely to this site and how it will be redeveloped. You know, at Wells Fargo, we're very focused on creating a more inclusive, sustainable future for all residents in the communities we serve. And as we move out of the pandemic, it's really important to us that all residents in the community can have a positive recovery that's going to include, you know, equity and resiliency for the future. And so at the core of the work that we do is really our desire to move along a path of creating racial and social equity for all. And the way that we do this is through 4 key focus areas that we have at Wells Fargo, which is housing affordability, financial health, small business growth, and environmental justice. And so those are our focuses. So when we thought about the site at 3030 Nicollet and we thought about the redevelopment and what we could do, we started thinking about who would be a good partner for that project. And to be honest with you, PPL was a natural when we knew of their interest, and then working in combination with the Cultural Wellness Center. One of the things that I think is really important is what we're doing tonight. We're listening. And the second thing is that we're going to take that information and create something great on that site as a collaborative effort. So I just want to thank you all for coming tonight. And I want you to also know that we didn't come here with any preconceived solutions tonight. We're here to listen and to hear what you have to say. I'd encourage you to attend all or as many of the sessions as you can. And just thank you so much for coming. And I'm just going to listen and learn as we go. So thanks so very much.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you so very much. And I love the 4-pronged approach that the Wells Fargo Foundation and Wells Fargo is putting into application for this project and for all the work that you do here in the Twin Cities, across the state, the region, and the nation. You've got quite a footprint. That word, it comes up again. Now we're going to move into this next portion, which is introducing the creative partners, those individuals who have teamed up through what's known as Pollen Creative Agency, Pollen Studio. Now the 4 artists who have worked, they're all out of South Minneapolis. This organization is bent on exploring creativity through the vibrant work and the social impact of storytelling and engagement from artists such as Marlena Miles, Bayou Thomas, Jordan Hamilton, Hussein Ali, These 4 artists are part of the team that'll be joining together with their talents as we continue partnering. And as PPL, as Paul put it, has that large minivan, which is turning into a small bus now with all the partners that are going to be riding along on this journey. So with that being said, I'd like to turn it back over to Anthony, who has more of our program ahead of us to share. Anthony?
Thank you, T. Michael. And really, again, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Patty. We actually, again, are really excited. I think that Patty really began to allude to the fact of the idea of choosing who they were going to partner with and what the importance of that. And really all of this is really, again, a statement regarding what the future will be. One of the aspects of this that is a little bit different is that the Cultural Wellness Center is involved really as a collaborative partner around development. And one of the things that we have done is really looked at how does culture play into that and the work that's been happening there. So I would like to introduce to you all Elder Atumazah here, the founder and executive director of the Cultural Wellness Center, that really will begin to lay a foundation of conversation for us related to the role of culture. So welcome, Elder Atum.
So good evening, everyone. I am really happy that we have people with us tonight, many people that we know very well. So I'm grateful that you were able to trust our invitation to you. We really know that at this time of the day, with all that's going on and in our lives and around us in South Minneapolis, that there's reason for you to have chosen to go someplace else. So I'm grateful that you decided to join us for this launching of something that you have, I'm sure, imagined wanting to be involved with for a really long time. I think the things that I want to share just quickly, number one is as you go through the evening and the upcoming sessions with us, I'd like you to listen for some words like investment, words like valuing, words like broadening definitions of power, words that broaden the definition of ownership. We would like you to do as a Cultural Wellness Center has done for 25 years, and you heard this already tonight. Your voice is what's incorporated in your voice are ideas, ways of thinking, ways of knowing. You have in your voice, in this case, this kind of development, you're not going to do what one of the writers for the Star Tribune said. You're not coming to have people gawk at your pain, your suffering over the years. That is not what this is about. It is about the assets. It's about the resiliency. It's about the major, beautiful ideas, the thinking that you've done, and the things you have achieved, and the ideas you have about where you want to invest. Where do you want to take your assets to invest? And we want you to be listening for us as Cultural Wellness Center in particular, as a new partner in development. We are a new partner. We wouldn't have chosen anyone else over PPL, Project for Pride in Living. NDC and the Cultural Wellness Center have worked together in many ways around community development. But this one is where the Cultural Wellness Center not only brings people to the table to talk, but we bring people to the table to build, to invest, to think about owning together, to listen, but that listening is a different kind of listening, and the building is a different kind of building. As you know, for these 25 years, many of you have known us to build human value, to find many ways as we can for cultural survival, for culture as a resource, for culture as an asset, and an asset that has been underrated. And what this team is going to do, these partners are doing, is really saying that you bring culture, you bring ways, you bring value, and all of that we want to hear about. And we want in hearing to think about, and with you think about, how do we build with that at the core of what we're going to be doing. So we're not inviting you to a table. We're saying that these ideas, the weight of your ideas, the vision of investment, the vision of ownership is going to be broadened. And at this point, we want to figure out, how do we put that all together? Because to be honest, we all come to the table knowing that we haven't done this before very well. This time, we want to perfect a model, and we really are grateful that you have joined us to really understand how to do that. I want to just finally say, often I'm so excited about this, the work that the Cultural Wellness Center does. As you know, I get very excited and inspired. But this time, what is going to be so powerful is we will have hundreds of people who are excited and inspired enough to want to invest in ways that haven't happened before. So I'm really grateful to you, and I thank you for joining us. And I thank the partners for making sure that the Cultural Wellness Center can hold our integrity to you, the people in the community who have taken us out into the place for the last 25 years and this coming years. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Elder Atum. Now, I want to draw attention to an area in this conversation where we're going to invite participants to respond to a poll of different questions, questions that are important for us to respond to and to really give life and meaning to them. Many of them are questions that may seem somewhat matter of fact, but they're very deep in that they really respond to the wholeness and the authenticity of each of us as players and members of the community that we're enriching and doing the work that we heard Elder Atum speak to, and that is the cultural asset, broadening the definitions around ownership, around accessibility, and around what happens when we all have our voice and feel validated and equal, that equity and resiliency. Now, the questions that we're going to ask you to respond to in the chat go as follows. What I'd like to ask, we will be taking note of your responses in the chat as we ask these questions. So we'll take about 5 minutes to respond to these questions. So bear with us, and it may not take that long. We'll proceed after we feel the last person has responded. The first question that we have for you, and give it some thought here, it may not be that deep. How long have you lived in the United States? How long have you lived in the United States? Is it 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 70, 70 to 100. Centenarians, I'm really looking forward to that 70 to 100. I hope that you're out there. How long have you lived in the United States? That, I'm sure, frames and shapes your perceptions and your attitudes and your beliefs and your behaviors, determining the length of time you've been here in the United States. Let's move on to the next question. How long have you lived in Minneapolis? How long have you lived in Minneapolis? I'm seeing it populated 50 years, 21 years, 11 years. The responses are adding up in the chat. We thank you for that. We thank you for your responses. Another 11 years in there, 17, 42. The numbers are broad and wide and the responses to that length of time. 1 month, welcome for 1 month. Now the next, and that being the third question is, who is your community? This will take more than just a simple response. It may take you a moment to really allow that to sink in and to respond in narrative form in the chat, but who is your community? What does that look like? When we define community, that could be familia, that would be genetic community membership, that could be those people who bring that sort of wealth and richness to your life, extended family and community. It could be something found in a spiritual community. It has a breadth of different definitions, and it's totally up to you to respond to that question of who is your community. Minneapolis, the Black community, the LGBTQ community. Community is made up of family, people of African heritage. These answers are coming in, thank you. Where I work, the majority of a Muslim community, African community, yes. Thank you for taking this on and responding. Neighbors and close friends. My definition of community, someone has actually defined it for us based on their perception and their attitudes around what community means for them. My colleagues, students, the queer community, the progressive family, longtime friends. It goes on. In the interest of our time allotment, we're going to go to the fourth and last of these 4 poll questions. And that one is, who are your people? As I say in East Texas, where my family is from, who your people is. So who are your people? Those folks whose shoulder you lean on. It may be, you may think it's the community, but who are your people is a deeper dive into relationship. My people are part of my community, but my people have touchstones of different elements that really, really resonate why they are my people. The souls of my people, the eyes of my people. That's the Langston Hughes piece that speaks to the experience of the African diaspora. So who are your people? Humble-hearted, I love that one. A beating heart and a loving affection, great. These are all amazing responses and so fitting for our conversation that we're hearing the questions and responding. I think that because we have so much more ahead of us, we're going to invite you to continue populating the chat, but we're going to take this moment over and send it to Anthony that has some more of our program ahead of us. Thank you for your responses. Thank you so much.
Thanks, T. Michael. As before we move ahead, I did want to thank our support team at the Cultural Wellness Center, Sister Peace, Brother Minkara, Comfort Dando, who's online with us as well, and really the whole team at the Cultural Wellness Center. In the spirit of our work around culture, and really for tonight, one of the things we're doing, and I want to go back, Paul said something about building capacity. And one of the aspects of building capacity that we are really committed to relative, particularly to communities that have been marginalized or under-resourced or are living in traumatic times like we are, is that we also want to work on this idea of expanding the capacity for a community to imagine for itself. Because one of the things that we're about to do in this process is really to ask you questions related to your ability to imagine a future that is different, that is more beneficial for you. And so what we're going to try to do today is spend some time actually mapping out for all of us a process of how did we get to here, standing on Nicollet Lake in 2021 on this day in this moment. And part of that takes us to the very, very beginning. And so in the spirit of that, we really do want to acknowledge that before there was Lake Street, there were a people here. That we are about, at Lake and Nicollet, we're about 7 miles from really a place that translates as the name Bedote. It translates as where two waters come together. It's called Bedote, and it's a very sacred place for the Dakota people. And really, it's the center of their world. That really, it's a place that carries a complicated and layered history. And thousands of years, the Dakota people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here. And in several hundred years since the European settlers colonized the land that the state of Minnesota now occupies, the United States land seizures were really a project of spiritual destruction. It denied the Dakota people free and unhindered access to the land, and really access to a land that fundamentally shapes their identity and their spirituality. And in the spirit of understanding that, we want to point to that as a beginning, and really honor those first people, and really see a very clear linkage to this moment and our intentions around the development here and the interaction that really was had with those first communities. So you can go to the next slide. That here in the 19th century, when the first European traders arrived in Minnesota, as I said, the land belonged to the Dakota and Ojibwe people, and the really among the first to migrate here were really the British, the English, the Scots, the British Canadians, and many of them settled in the Twin Cities areas. And really, as white settlers moved in, both the Dakota and the Ojibwe hunter-gatherer societies faced, great changes, especially with the development of Fort Snelling at that area called Bedote, at the really the connection of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers in the 1820s. Next slide, please. From St. Anthony really became the building of really Minneapolis. And during this time, I guess we would call it limited technology, but really thousands of workers were recruited to really construct a fledgling district of infrastructure with canals and dams. The railroads needed to propel milling industry and the milling boom that was happening there. And really what they were hoping to do was create a New England of the West, where migrants at this time, still calling themselves Yankees, were really speculators and businessmen. And it was really varied, and it varied a lot to Minnesota for them as their new home. But really, again, peoples from that now we may call white, but the Welsh, the Swiss, the German butchers, cigar makers, English masons, and Scots bakers, all of them, again, coming to Minnesota with the intention of remaking a Philadelphia, remaking a Virginia. And even in this time, what we saw was the Germans, of course, were the largest community here, really between 1806 and 1905. And slowly, what we begin to see that begins to shape what we probably think about a lot as the culture of Minnesota is really the movements of the Swedes into this community. In a community that we know inside the borders of Minneapolis, really Powderhorn Park and the surrounding neighborhoods are beginning to prosper. And Lake Street is still a country road at this point. And what begins to happen is really the cycling craze, believe it or not, in 1880. And for many people, you will not be surprised that I honed in on this point. But go to the next slide, please. As I said, Lake Street was at this point on the edge of the city, but the biking boom is taking off. And it is a moment in time that is important because really what it begins to represent is really mobility, that people are moving in community. And there are reports at this time that people, that we're developing a trail system that connects residents all the way out to Minnehaha Falls on the edge of the universe and Fort Snelling, and that these communities, these roads are so popular that pedestrians have to wait 20 minutes to get across them. Next slide, please. As I said, what begins to happen is really during this first decade, there's really an influx of Swedes, Swedish-born population that moves into the Twin Cities. These migrants at this point, as they are called, but really immigrants, begin to dominate this previous German community. And right now, I think the Swedish-born population in Minnesota is about 61%. and 70% of those live in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And the turn of the century is a really important time for the development of neighborhoods within the city, which really are highly influenced by these inhabitants. And while the Twin Cities British were widespread, what we call commonly Ward 8 along Lake Street is really a northern border. And by 1911, both Minneapolis, Welsh, and then the Greeks began to relocate a church in these communities along Lake Street. And although we have the slight memories of this through St. Mary's Greek Orthodox Church in the Lakes, there is a growing and significant Greek church in this community. At this point, transportation begins to play a larger and larger part in Minneapolis in terms of the development of Minneapolis neighborhoods. And again, as I said, as there was a cycling craze, but it does begin to die down. And of course, the horse-drawn carriage takes over at this point. And again, the development of roads, and particularly the development of roads along Park Avenue and Lake Street, all the way to the west at what was called Lake Calhoun, what we now call Bademakaska. In 1905, there's really a big boom and a big push around housing development. And in 1896, really what begins to happen along Lake Street is what we will later become to see as Automobile Row. Next page, please. Next slide. At the end of the 20s is really an important era, and that there is something comes along in terms of developing along Lake Street is really, again, around mobility and transportation. What develops right away at this point, I think we all know Amazon, but the Amazon of its day is Sears and Roebuck. On Lake Street is the Sears distribution center. And so again, you have to think this is the 1920s. People are actually looking into something, a big catalog of offerings from all over the country, all over the world, making selections along those options, paying for it remotely, and then it being delivered to their home. And again, this is 1920. So Amazon really has nothing on Sears, except they're still in business. But again, we see this huge growth, largely due to transportation. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of the Regal Sears and Roebuck building really in about 1940. And as you all know this today, this is the center of what we may call our universe, and the Pulse is really the global market. And this is still standing, as you know, and still being utilized actively. So go to the next slide, please. I do want to, and as I said, mobility is really the order of the day and is really critical. So here's another activity for us to engage in. And I want you to think about this, is that this is a transportation map that shows, and we have light rail, we have new light rail here in the last 10 years. But this is a map showing the distribution of rail system for Minneapolis and St. Paul. And my question to you all, and Minkara, are we doing this in the chat? Nope, we are not. Here we go. We have a poll for you. What I'd like you to do is I want you to tell me, please, how long will it take for us to develop this transportation system, the map that we see, how long will it take for us to develop this rail system in Minneapolis and St. Paul? So go at it. So I'm going to give you 30 more seconds to answer, please. And Minkara, when you are ready, you can show us the answers from our poll. Okay, thank you. So top answer, 25 to 50 years. Okay, so, and the people that said 100 years may be closer because I would like you all to understand that this is a route map for Minneapolis and St. Paul from 1937. In 1937, during this era, there was a rail system that ran down Lake Street and that connected you all over the Twin Cities. And we only dream of a rail system that will be this complete at some point. And so for all of the people that are on our call from the city, we are dreaming of this, and stay with us. This could be the beginning of that. So next slide, please. The other thing that develops for us, really, particularly at our site at Lake and Nicollet, in 1896, there is the development of a ball field that Minneapolis, Minnesota is home for a minor league, Minneapolis Millers of the Western League and the American Association between 1896 and 1955. And this is literally the site where we are planning this development. This is where the former home of Wells Fargo, and this is the site that we are developing right now. So I share this to let you know that this is 1896, that there was a plan already bringing people heavily to this area as far back as 100 years. Next slide, please. But what happens along Lake Street is as I said, is that really the priority at this point, and if you are able to see, you see the tracks here, but by 1950, the city is beginning to make a different decision. And instead of prioritizing mobility, I think in the form of trains and what was going on, we begin to prioritize the automobile as the primary means of transportation. Lake Street really becomes focused on this. There is a demand from businesses to close the trolley system. And in response to that, the city spends $1.5 million to remove the train tracks and pave and widen the street. They pull down the power lines and they have a ton of power. So what they do is they put up a system of bright fluorescent lamps, and suddenly Lake Street became the longest stretch of fluorescent lighting in the world, and is literally talked about in the same vein as great streets in the Cours Vincent in Paris, talked about the great streets in Rio de Janeiro, and West Broadway, and Lake Street is compared to the great streets of West Germany. And so this prioritizing the automobile is really critical in terms of what's happening now. Next slide, please. So now that Lake Street is reborn as a bright and glittering wide avenue, what happens is it does become Automobile Row. It is full of car dealerships. It becomes a place full of shops and restaurants, and it is perfect for the giant oversized cars of 1950 to 1960s, and none of us remember that, but they were big, people. And it becomes about cruising. There's a Bridgman's, of course, traveling to Sears. There's the A&W, there's a White Castle, Snyder's, Talktown Diner is still there. Family, you can still go see that on Lake Street, right? But again, most of this is all, about the automobile. In downtown Minneapolis, there is a huge building built called the Fauché Tower. And it is marks, again, technology, and really at this moment in time is the beginning, and part of the commitment to the automobile is also the commitment to America's suburbs. It is also a commitment in terms of infrastructural investment in our highway system that fundamentally begins to move businesses out of the inner city, because people are moving out of the inner city, and primarily you have to understand these are investments that are being made by our federal government in the highway system, and with cheaper land in the suburbs, it begins to really devastate what is happening in the community along Lake Street. Next slide, please. And this hometown feel begins to create a sense of emptiness. And I'm showing this slide because they actually had a literal breakfast club where people had a name on a cup that they came in and enjoyed breakfast. And so this feeling of community that existed slowly began to be eroded. The next slide, please. Over this next period of time, where it went from automobile roll of new car dealerships, it slowly shifts to being a focus of used car dealerships. There is a slow erosion of the community in terms of crime. And even at this time, there is a strategy beginning to emerge around broken window policing. There are stories about, again, one broken window leads to another, which leads to graffiti, which leads to prostitution, which leads to robbery. And the city of Minneapolis begins this this very early in the late 50s, between the 50s and 80s, and really begins to, again, over-police this community. By 1998, the last car dealership moves off Lake Street, and it is a Dodge dealership that moves out to Roseville. Next slide, please. Between 1980 and 2000, there were major demographic shifts as well. And I'm going to just point primarily to the Phillips neighborhood, point to which includes West Phillips at this time. In 1980, white community members constituted 65% of the population. By the year 2000, they were on 24% of the population, while the African-American population, while only 8% in 1980, is up to 30% in 2000. And the growing Latinx community at that point is up to 22%. The most egregious and interesting piece of this is that the Indigenous community that was closer to 20% in 1980 declines to about 11% by the year 2000. And so there is a demographic shift. And Powderhorn neighborhood in particular, in 1990 was comprised of, was 70% white. And in the year 2000, it declined to 40% white. And those shifts and those changes have continued in many ways for a long time. And so now we're seeing a shift the other direction, that particularly in Powderhorn. But next slide, please. Not that one, right? One of the things that does begin to happen as we are really talking is that we're looking at a way where there's a shift happening, and as we describe what's happening around who's moving away from a community, issues around over-policing, what I believe that we are seeing, and oftentimes we think about, is this is about the character of the people in a community. And we begin to assign pathologies to what's happening to the people there. And one of the things that we are clear about, and we are committed to, I think our partners are committed to, is that is absolutely not true. And in many regards, we plan to prove and show that it may be the opposite, that we really are looking at a result. Go to the next slide, please. We have always talked about the ways that you've heard about redlining. And in this slide, what I'm simply showing is that policy and practice really begins to work against the people. And we talked about redlining, and so I wanted to actually show you an example of where redlining comes from. And these are two different maps. And if you are good, if you can see this, you can see what these are. And so I'm going to ask, if you will, for me, please, really quickly, the map on the right is what community? Just throw it in the chat real quick. And you get $100 if you get the right answer. Not really. You do not get the $100. Anybody, any guess what neighborhood that is? There's a big clue right in the middle, right? Thank you very much. This is Diamond Lake, South Minneapolis. And it is, according to, this is from the home loan organization, our federal organization that is approving home loans. And again, of course, the red map on the left is near north. This is North Minneapolis. Sumner Olson is here. And this is where redlining comes from. This is literally the federal government and working with our state and city government and mortgage organizations doing this. This is how they were grading neighborhoods and making a community loan worthy or not. Go to the next slide, please. The next slide that I'm showing you is really this idea that we believe that there's another thing happening, which is this idea of progress over people. That really the construction of 35W in South Minneapolis has huge implications. And although we point to Rondo and we talk about it a lot, there's not very much consideration for the ways that 35W played havoc. And Lake and Nicollet is one of those areas. I mean, they built it through there, that no exits directly there, and they took out the number of houses was significant. They shortly after, this is 1959, they began to, they raised 50 square blocks to actually put this in through South Minneapolis. And really, they take it straight through the community and deeply impact in Minneapolis, what is the historically Black African-American Economics District. And really, it is very, very sad. Our next slide, please. And then the next piece of this that I'm going to show you, if anybody recognizes this, this is the wall at Nicollet Avenue. This is the wall on the north side of what became the development at Lake and Nicollet for the Kmart site. And I think that the most important thing around this is to really understand that the decision to make this site was really a decision by the city to try to immediately fill a hole related to tax increment financing and strategies that have been used to grow development during this era of time. And again, this was a strategy to move forward. And Kmart basically drew a line in the sand and said that we will only build there if we're able to close off the street and have it dump into our parking lot. And the city actually folded on that. Next slide, please. And so this is the Lake Street of the 70s and 80s. Next slide, please. And again, after making, next slide, progress and making policy over people, we wind up with a street that is not really fit for humans in a real way. It's not designed to impact humans and people and really commerce. And so we again understand that we have been working against policy and against those practices to fight for our communities. So I would like to, as we do this, I want to invite Elder Atum back, please, and I would like you to talk to us about the idea of culture from the perspective of the Cultural Wellness Center, please. And I believe we'll also have a poll.
Well, I'm so moved by what you have presented to us tonight on a couple of reasons. Is because very, very seldom do we hear history that is stated in the way you have, which is in the interest of the people around the circle here tonight. It's in our interest that we have now given you what we believe is close to what happened and why it happened and in whose interest it was happening. Culture always existed in those circumstances that you have seen tonight. Culture was present, but it was a cultural kind of dominance that said that the most visible, the people who were very, very, very visible, and the visibility had to do with what we now talk about as color. That it was racialized. People were really racialized into kind of these categories of color. And what we do with the Cultural Wellness Center, as you have seen Anthony talk about and present to you, is that we go beneath the surface. It's what you see is really an element, but it is not the core. It is not the spirit. It is not the soul. It is not the real asset that human beings bring. It's the visible. But what culture is for us is it is spirituality. It is symbol. It is knowledge. It's heritage. It's ways of knowing, ways of being. It is survival. It's resiliency. It is really practices that give us capacity to continue and also to be cohesive. So as you saw, continuity and cohesion really being attacked in this way, not wanting us to be together, not wanting us to live together, not wanting us to believe in both a past and a future. So Culture for the Cultural Wellness Center is a resource. Culture is what people create to give themselves continuity and cohesion. Continuity and cohesion. So language, those things that people choose. The Cultural Wellness Center came into existence because for people of African heritage, cultural survival, cultural resurrection is the foundation on which we give our commitment to this work. It's not a service, it's not a complaint. It is an acknowledgement that our humanity is in place, that it came from a place that had to do with, once again, creation and the creator. And it is not based in religion, but it is based in peoplehood. It is based in community, communing, collective living, collective being together. It is also continuity in that it comes from the origin of humanity, not the origin of race or geography. And so that's what we are bringing to the table to consider as the core for asset development, for building. And now we won't be building from the outside in, we will be building from the inside out. And it's that inside that has value, that inside that will be weighted. And I really mean that weighted. So look for those opportunities to look at what does it weigh to have existed, as you've heard about the indigenous people. What is the weight of their existence to be considered as other people in this circle will be doing? The weight of your existence, our existence together. How will that be incorporated into a physical development? That's what we're talking about. That's what we're doing. That's what our partners, Project for Pride in Living and Wells Fargo, that's what we now are putting together, but it has to be guided by you, your sense of culture, your sense of beingness on the planet, not your sense of beingness on Lake Street. You didn't start on Lake Street and you will not end on Lake Street. But in between, Lake Street will be different because you exist.
Thank you. And that is really a really important thing about in terms of, again, this idea of how will this show up in the physical development. And so we really, again, talk about culture as an asset. And Minkara, can you do me a favor? I'm going to have you go to Daniel's slide. That is perfect. I want to introduce you to really a great friend of the South Side and of the city and of Untold Stories. I want to introduce you to Daniel Bergen, and I am introducing you to him tonight because one of the communities that we do not often consider as immigrating and being a part of the immigration story that we are telling and about to tell is the African American community. And so Daniel, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Minkara, can you please let him share, control
I think I do
screen.
have permission to share my
Okay.
screen. Thank you, Anthony. And I really appreciate that point, that idea of how we come to Minnesota. So many different paths for many of us, but for African Americans, that idea of the Great Migration, of post-Civil War, really refugee status, and all those different eddies and streams that brought us to the north. and the ways that shows up. I really appreciate this whole initiative as someone who grew up a few blocks south of Lake Street in the Powderhorn neighborhood, a lifelong South Sider, coming to you from the South Side, not far from George Floyd Square, where, as we all know today, we saw kind of the removal of some of of us, really, and so I think this conversation is important in a couple of ways. And as Anthony asked me recently to join, just really framed it as this idea of place, but people as well. And that our history shows that, structures and edifices and buildings are important, but more important are the people who moved through them, who built them sometimes, and how people make change and not always just structures. The structures can make change because of the people. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit. And I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you are seeing Willie Mays. So Anthony mentioned Nicollet Field, an important building in the history of sports in Minnesota, and certainly Lake and Nicollet. But for me, when I think of Nicollet Field, the first thing that comes to mind is the brief but glorious run of Willie Mays, one of the greatest to play the game here on the South Side at Nicollet Field. So, that idea of that place is important history, but that Willie Mays was there and that he lived in our community, lived on 4th Avenue, just south of Hosmer Library, is equally important. So, that idea of people and place continues in some of my explorations. And Elder Toom, I really appreciate your framing this work and this conversation tonight around assets and strength, because that's something that I try and do in my films. So a film like Jim Crow of the North is important to look at the redlinings and the racist restrictive covenants that led to them, but also our resilience and resistance in the 100 years that systemic racism like that has been kind of foisted upon us. And so I wanted to share, and I'm just gonna show you some images. This is like home movies. I'm not gonna actually play a clip, but I wanted to introduce some of you. Many of you will know, but some of you may not know about a person named Wayne Glanton. So when Anthony told me about this work, and I was really excited to hear about Wells Fargo, who I've worked with on a few projects, lifting up stories and about wealth development and culture and how it works with our banking system. It made me think of Wayne Glanton. So Wayne Glanton was a pioneer in the construction trade. He was a South Sider, World War II veteran, graduated from Central High, and in his struggles, he found a way and made a way and created a construction company and had a hand in building hundreds of buildings really in the upper Midwest. And this building, one of his offices, was at 37th and Nicollet. And so Mr. Glanton is one of those instances where, while he built structures, including and most notably the Spokesman Building on 38th and 4th Avenue on the National Register of Historic Places, Mr. Glanton himself is a community builder beyond the buildings, in that he was a mentor. He passed it on. He helped African Americans get involved in the trades. These are some images from some of the work he did, where he really made an effort to bring more African Americans into construction in the 60s and 70s. And so Wayne Glanton is one of those people who really are the builders, in this case, literal community builders, but also, a lesson to learn in terms of when we're constructing a new space like the plans you all are working on, who's doing the building? Who are the contractors? Who are being engaged in the business of building? And so I want us to invoke Mr. Glanton, who's still with us in his 90s, when we think about that phase of this project. And then just before I leave you all, just wanted to show some home movies. And this is always one of my favorite pieces of found footage. Some of you will recognize who we're seeing. This is her sister, but as the camera adjusts up, you will see none other than Lena Smith, Minnesota's first African-American female attorney. And there she is in her offices. Lena was a South Sider. Her house is on the National Register of Historic Places. There's all her law books, apparently. But Lena, again, is a community builder, and she's one of these people who really represent the strength and resilience and also wellness. You know, Lena was very supportive of the settlements in Phyllis Wheatley. She was very involved in Wheatley. And so she represents the law and activism, but also this idea of wellness. And I really appreciate that theme running through your work. Now this film footage continues, and in walks young Dr. Brown. Some people on the call will recognize the Brown family. In fact, if you talk to people of a certain age in Minneapolis and you mention Dr. Brown, senior or maybe junior, they'll say, he delivered me. The Browns were our Crutchfields, Paul, in terms of Minneapolis and that kind of multi-generational Black doctor family. So I've been really interested in Dr. Brown and, looking for where his offices were, but that's not what's important, is where he officed. It was the person. In this case, there's young Dr. Brown. I think we get to see his father, there he is, with a cigar in his medical office. I don't know about that, but so the people, like the Cultural Wellness Center and Elder Atum, it's about the people as well as the place. And that's the theme I wanted to leave you all with as you continue to do this important work for Lake Street. And thank you for it. Again, as a Southsider born and raised, I'm looking forward to seeing how this progresses.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And Daniel he's a great, every neighborhood needs a Homer, right? You need somebody who loves your neighborhood so much that you take it everywhere you go. Every neighborhood needs that. And I really need, as we do this, I hope you all, that this neighborhood becomes that for you. Thanks, Mankara. One of the things that we're going to do is talk about culture, and in quick ways. We talked about the resilience and the response, and one of the things that we are proposing to you is that cultural corridors, and Lake Street has been designated a cultural corridor. And one of the ways that people often think about it is a place where people go to experience other people's culture. And what we are proposing to you is that cultural corridors themselves, and this is more actually what happened, is that they are areas that may have been abandoned by the majority community. Something happens, they make a decision, there's a better place to be. And they move, and now the community is what they call boarded up. It is crime ridden, it is a challenge. And what happens is some cultural community, and in this case, I'm pointing to really we can point to the AAPI community along Nicollet Avenue. We can point to the Latinx community along Lake Street. Initially, we can talk to the African-American community on the South Side, and we can point to eventually the Somali community. But I want to point to another pioneer. I feel like another person like Daniel Bergen, who sees the asset in the community and sees that the culture is an asset. And for some of you, you may not have seen this. Wing Young, who actually has an office on 37th in Chicago still, did an art installation along Lake Street. Next slide, please. And what he did is he fundamentally goes into community and really begins to, this is about 97 to 2000, he creates an art installation called Lake Street USA. And he begins to take pictures of the average life, and he interviews and talks to people about the average life. And what he sees, next slide, please, is that the community is diverse, that these people have come here and begun to rebuild, and revitalize Lake Street. And the greatest asset they have is their culture. Next slide, please. That what they begin to build on, and I think when we think about cultural corridors as places where people consume culture, what these communities have done is they're building their businesses. Cultural corridors are built on businesses by businesses owners who are serving their own community. They are actually initially meeting the unmet needs of their community from the perspective of culture. So you see quinceañera stores, right? Popping up to meet the needs of those communities. That you see the food that is being served is authentic because it is designed to meet the needs of those people along the community. Next slide, please. that they are organizing and meeting the educational, meeting the religious needs, is that all of these cultural communities come in and they build religious institutions, they build businesses that serve their social and spiritual needs, that they, next slide please, that they continue to build in a place that was left. And what they do is they literally, this revitalization began to happen. We are defining cultural corridors as places that communities who are connected to their culture, who are looking for a way to transcend time, that they are creating the resilience is a commitment to the future, and they see possibility. And they come into what we call cultural corridors and build this. Next slide, please. That they are open, that these communities are diverse, right? And next slide, please. And what really holds them together is this, and I am, Wing Young Lee, you have to visit him, sees this and creates this installation. Next slide. The next slide that I'm showing you is the global market in its worst days. And this is the installation. I want you to see the scale of the installation. This is all along Lake Street. And what happens that is very interesting is that this public installation is put in, and he goes to businesses all along Lake Street. And no one, I want to say west of Nicollet Avenue, would allow him to include their buildings in the installation. And this is pre-global market. But again, this is, I point to this as a moment of clarity for us in community relative to the ways that the role that culture plays in revitalizing and anchoring of people in the community, and really in some regards saving our city. And it is an amazing asset, and I am pointing that. So next slide, please. The next and most recent iteration of this, of course, is the Somali community that emerges in the South Side. And again, another community, an immigrant community that moves here. This community that is small in the 90s rises, they organize geographically, that they begin to build stores, again, to serve their community, and slowly build up and begin to revitalize Lake Street. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The next thing that we see, and I point to the global market, and the global market is a project that is an extension. The conversation and what the city had to be convinced of, right, was that we could build this location, that it could be economic, and that culture would be at the center of this project, that it would be a cultural center for the boulevard. And the global market stands today as really a testament to that. And so again, I point to these communities all along Lake Street. I point to Lake and Nicollet as an opportunity for us to really begin to think about how are we going to be engaged and really see culture as our key asset in terms of how we will experience these spaces. So as we get involved, and we're asking you to stay involved, to really see the possibility as we come back and we talk about design and what we're doing programmatically and what's happening in the building, we want you to bring culture first. We want you to bring your imagination that is expanded by an analysis that says that you are still here and you have the most powerful piece of who you are and everything you need right now to actually be engaged and involved in what comes next. For all of us, how we got here, we have to point back to really a moment that became a movement. Next slide, please. So again, I say that about a year ago, the murder of George Floyd happens in our community. And really there's also a community response to that. Next slide, please. And if you remember, this is a year ago, and I remember how horrific and how amazing this was. This is South Minneapolis, family. Next slide, please. The piece of this, again, that is important is really about the resilience. Next slide, please. Because the community response at this point is really that we will find opportunities for solidarity, that immediately the next days, the community organized itself, that it brought its own tools, it collaborated with the city, it collaborated with institutions like Wells Fargo, it collaborated with small businesses and big businesses. Our team from PPL was out there with us, the Cultural Wellness Center team, the Global Market family. I mean, we really stood out there in solidarity and began to rebuild our community. Next slide, please. The other piece that emerged immediately was the artist. And so I really point to the fact that the artist is an integral part of a cultural response to whatever is happening. That as we begin to look forward and we think about what we will create together and what we imagine to be in this space, is that the artist, this is 2 days after the worst post George Floyd. And I biked the entire city and took these pictures myself. Next slide. That it begins to take form. This is at 38th in Chicago within a week after George Floyd's murder. Next slide, please. That this is missing a picture. This emerges into a large-scale installation, George Floyd Square, as was noted, that was Chicago Avenue was open today. But we know that there is a community commitment. There's a civic commitment to what will rise in the future as really as international destination for social justice advocates around the world, because this movement was felt around the world. And I want to, the next part of, and we're closing, we're getting close to closing. One of the things that I would like to do is I want to introduce you to a partner of ours, a leader of ours that has been struggling and fighting alongside us through this. And one of the things that, just as we started with a land acknowledgement, one of the things that Andrea Jenkins was one of the first people that I heard do this, and we are formalizing it, this idea of a community policy acknowledgement, this idea of an acknowledgement of the ways that communities have been challenged by the way that policy has been wielded against them, the ways that institutionalized practice and systems have worked against them. And for all of us, as we are working to envision this next development in this partnership, is that part of it is really to understand that part of what we're looking at is not the building, but the systems around the building. And that the ways that we can leverage these investments with our human capital investments to decide what extends here. And the questions that we'll be asking in the future will be for you to think about: what are the areas that have the greatest impact on your lived experience? So right now, what I'd like to do is introduce someone who I admire deeply, inspires me regularly, and is always open. Councilmember Vice President Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you so much, Mr. Taylor, and thank you all for inviting me to just be a part of this conversation. As has been stated, it is very exciting. Interestingly enough, much of what I had hoped to talk about has been discussed throughout all the great presentations, but I do want to just, as you stated, acknowledge that, we stand on Dakota, Lakota, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe land, but we also recognize and acknowledge that this is a country that has been built on and with slave labor. And so we understand that, and we know that that is always a context for any conversations that we are having, particularly broad community dialogues where we are discussing how we can build our communities. We need to have that as sort of context. I'm just really excited about this project. It is in the Lindale neighborhood, which is absolutely a part of um, the 8th Ward. I smile a bit when about the poll of how long it might take us to rebuild the transit system that was laid out earlier that traveled all the way through St. Paul. I was one of the 11% of people who said it would probably take pretty close to 75 to 100 years. And I say that because one of the largest developments that will be transportation projects that will be at the site of this housing development is the Orange Line, or the I-35W bus rapid transit line, which will have a stop right at Lake Street. It will be steps from this development when it arises. And that project, from initiation to its completion, which will be this November, I'm sorry, this September, I'm knocking on wood. But that project took about 19 years from its inception to somebody actually getting on a bus. And that was a bus line, not a fixed rail line, Anthony. So, you know, the cost of those kinds of developments have risen so much, as well as the political conversations around who can go where, you know, which is why Detroit literally paid cities to tear up their rail systems to usher in this era of cars. And I also smiled when you talked about how Lake Street was the automobile capital, and I smile because I remember that, Anthony. I am that old. I remember when there were new car dealerships on Lake Street. But I also smile because you could go buy a new car on Lake Street, but then if you wanted to get that car repaired, you would drive over to 38th Street, which is also a cultural corridor. And also the unfortunate home to where George Floyd was murdered. This community, this neighborhood has been in the news for the past year for all the wrong reasons. And once again, today, a painful reminder, the trauma has been sort of reinitiated. But you know, the reality is that we do and must rebuild our community, and we must build it back better. And I see this project, this housing project, that will be home to those immigrant communities and those many of those other folks that have been discussed throughout this presentation tonight. And to provide low income, safe, affordable housing for people, to provide home ownership opportunities so that people can begin to build wealth, and people of color in particular, and Black folks as well. And so, you know, I'm just really excited about this project. We know that 35W, again, as been stated, really bifurcated this community, displaced Black folks from the central neighborhoods, the Bryant neighborhood where I live, the Kingfield neighborhood. And, you know, I also smiled a little bit when Daniel brought up the Minneapolis Millers. And, you know, Willie Mays played for that team, but several other Black baseball players as well. And so some ways Minneapolis has been at the forefront and progressive city. And in many ways we have mirrored and perpetuated the same racial injustices that we see all over the country. And now is the time to rewrite that narrative, rewrite that story. And this project of PPL, Wells Fargo, the Cultural Wellness Center, designed by Mello, who we haven't discussed yet, but this project is a big part of changing that narrative. And so I'm just so thrilled to be a part of it and at the start of it, and we'll be thrilled when we begin to welcome new families into this development. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you all at upcoming meetings.
Thank you, CVP Jenkins. And so I will, one last, what I would like you to do, and I would like one last thing for you to think about, and thank you for your patience. And again, I do want to, we had a very complex and beautiful plan around interpreting, and it kind of, right as we got ready to start, kind of got in the way of itself. So we apologize for starting late, and we will not do that again. Thank you for your patience tonight. I do want to leave you with one question based on what we've been talking about, and I want you all thinking about this. I would love for some people to put an answer in the chat if they're able to, but I want you thinking about it because after this session, we are going to get to work. We are actually going to get to work in every time we come together. The first thing that I want you to think about is this: is what aspects of your culture will help rebuild our community more effectively than dominant cultural values. Does that make sense? That when you look at the values, look at the culture, your culture, what aspects of that culture, and maybe even more importantly, what aspects of the culture are you willing to invest in rebuilding the community, and that those values, those cultural ways of being will be more effective in rebuilding the community than dominant cultural values. So think about that. Please take it with you. And we have a poll for you that we would like you to leave with, and we can answer that poll for us. I mean, Cara, you want to put that up, and then I'm going to turn you over to T. Michael. And so as you are looking at this and looking at what we will create, what's going to be the impact of this development, not the development, but what will be the impact of the development, please choose the area, your top priority area, please. And as you answer that poll, I'm going to turn you over to T. Michael to say goodnight to us, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Anthony. I want to thank everyone who has participated with all of our programming this evening. We really can't say enough about your contributions and what you provided us with. We want to reach back to Paul and to Patty. We want to acknowledge Daniel for his wonderful, insightful look back and reflections upon our community. And of course, Andrea Jenkins, who shaped things and framed them in such a way that allowed us to launch into the next moment. We talked about our voices, and I intended on ending in one way, but I'm going to end with just a thought. John Edgar Wideman, a very remarkable writer, and essayist, and activist of his time, wrote some very powerful words I think speaks to this idea of cultural voice and what we are here to do and what we're asking of each person who's present tonight. And John Edgar Wideman wrote, "The process for me that is going to knit up the family, the culture, the collective family, all of us, is that we tell our own stories, that we tell them in our own way and they express our own values. And we keep on telling our stories despite the madness, despite the chaos, and despite the pressure not to tell. We must use our voices and we must use the power that we have and that we've been granted with. As someone said earlier, that those with a beating heart and a loving affection, that's what makes us human. That's what asks us to use our sense of humanity, compassion, and care and concern for our communities. This project is really at the core of that, and we ask you continue to join us for future meetings, the next one being on June 17th. We hope that you will register through Eventbrite, and we look forward to seeing you on June 17th. Thank you for joining us this evening. And I believe that we may even have the answer to that poll that might be able to take you on home with that thought. Anthony, what do you think? Here we go. Here's our poll, and it looks like housing and homelessness came in at 68%. Is that an 8? Look at my eyes. Woo! That's a 68%. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's what this project is about. Thanks again to the Wells Fargo Foundation, to PPL, for Pride for Living, and for all of you for coming here this evening. Elder Atum, Anthony, and Cara, our team of producers and persons making this possible this evening. Thank you all. Have a wonderful remainder of your evening. And remember to join us again on June 17th. Thank you.